Today, we're heading to Canton, Massachusetts. Now don't worry, this isn't about a Dunkin' Donuts heist gone wrong or Boston traffic finally claiming a victim. Though let's be honest, either one could be a crime worth documenting on its own. What happened here was something far darker. If you've ever wondered how far the good old boys club in policing can go, this case answers it in the most disturbing way possible. These officers were so busy protecting each other they seemed to forget the rest of us can still do basic math. A young, pregnant woman, an abusive cop, a timeline that makes no sense, and somehow the conclusion written into the record was suicide. But here's the part that should make everyone pause. When the people sworn to investigate a crime are the same ones being implicated, what hope does a family have for truth? What happened to Sandra Birchmore wasn't just a tragedy. It was a test of how far corruption will go to protect its own. Welcome back to the True Crime Family Channel. Today's story leaves us with one chilling truth. Sometimes all it takes is the smallest mistake to bring an entire cover-up crashing down. On the evening of February 1st, 2021, the security cameras inside an apartment complex in Canton, Massachusetts, captured a young woman stepping outside into the storm. That woman was 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore. She brushed the heavy snow from her car, then returned indoors. A powerful blizzard was sweeping across the state, the kind that made venturing out almost impossible. For most people, it meant staying inside for at least a day, maybe more. For Sandra, it turned out to be the final time anyone other than her alleged killer would ever see her alive. 3 days later, on the morning of February 4th, officers from the Canton Police Department were dispatched to the Canton Woods apartments. A call had come in from Sharon Public Schools. Staff there were worried about Sandra. She worked as an instructional aide, and she had not shown up for several days. The snowstorm had forced widespread cancellations earlier that week. But by midweek, life across Massachusetts had returned to its regular rhythm. Everyone was back at work. Everyone except Sandra. When officers entered her unit, the scene they found was grim. Sandra was on the floor of her bedroom. A strap was looped around her neck, tied to the closet door. She had been dead for some time, likely several days. For those who knew her, the discovery was devastating. Sandra had grown up in Stoughton, had joined the Police Explorers program as a teenager, and spent 6 years training alongside local officers. She was well known by law enforcement throughout Norfolk County. Now many of those same people were looking at her lifeless body. The officers on scene reported that nothing seemed out of place. They noted the apartment was cluttered, but no overturned furniture, no marks on the walls, no dragged carpeting, no sign of a fight. To them, it looked straightforward. A tragic suicide. That was the conclusion made on the spot. But when Sandra's family entered her apartment to collect her belongings, they saw something very different. The signs did not look like the life of a woman ready to give up. They found clothes soaking in the washer and another load still tumbling in the dryer. Newly purchased items sat unopened. Deliveries she had ordered continued to arrive even after her death. Most telling were the packages she had already received. A brand new stroller, tiny onesies, baby clothes carefully chosen. Sandra had been 3 months pregnant. Her friends uncovered a poster in her apartment, decorated with glitter, displaying an ultrasound photo with the words, "Congratulations. You're going to be a father." Then came something else that troubled the family. On the floor of Sandra's bedroom lay a thin gold necklace with a pink flamingo charm. It was a piece she wore often, a favorite of hers. When police found her body, the necklace was broken, dangling from the left side of her neck. The charm rested against her stomach. The chain had not come undone at the clasp. It had snapped apart, and tangled in it was a clump of her hair. To the officers who responded, the death was explained away in minutes. To Sandra's family, the evidence painted a very different story. A woman preparing for her baby, a room filled with signs of life interrupted, and a broken necklace that suggested someone had been there in her final moments. Sandra was rarely seen without her favorite necklace, a thin gold chain with a small pink flamingo charm. When responders found her body, that necklace was broken. It dangled from the left side of her neck, the charm resting against her stomach. It had not come undone at the clasp. Instead, the chain itself had snapped, and tangled in it was a thick clump of Sandra's hair. Her family quickly pointed this out to police, reminding them that she had been excited about her pregnancy and had been proudly wearing that necklace for years. But their concerns did not change anything. The first officers on scene had already made their judgment. From their quick examination, there was no sign of foul play. That version of events stuck. No serious reassessment was made. One of the most painful moments came when Sandra's aunt received the phone call every family dreads. An officer was tasked with telling her what they had found. His voice, heavy and halting, delivered the news. "I regret to tell you that Sandra is deceased." Her aunt cried out in shock, and the officer, unsure what else to say, added that Sandra's body would be taken by the medical examiner for an autopsy. Sandra's story did not begin with tragedy. Back in 2010, at only 12 years old, she applied to join the Police Explorers program in Stoughton. She stayed with it for 6 years. Robert Devine, who was running the program at the time, recalled that Sandra was fascinated by police officers. Friends later believed her deep attachment to law enforcement came from a need for stability. She had already suffered more loss than most children her age. Sandra's mother, with whom she was very close, had died while Sandra was still young. Not long after, she lost her grandmother as well. Her father had never been in her life. The pain of those losses stayed with her. Sandra received therapy throughout her teenage years and continued with counseling well into adulthood. Those who worked with her at the Explorers Academy were aware of her difficult background, but many still described her as warm, eager, and always wanting to belong. Sandra lived with her aunt in Stoughton until late 2020, when she finally moved into her own place in Canton. Friends noticed that even in her 20s, she often spoke in a youthful, almost childlike way. She overshared details about her life and tended to seek attention like a teenager might. Still, she had dreams for her future. She was employed as a classroom instructional assistant. Although co-workers said she did not always appear deeply invested in the work, she was sociable, loved to talk, and was making plans for what came next. Her real passion was elsewhere. Sandra had begun taking classes to prepare for nursing school. At the same time, she was planning for motherhood. By early 2021, she was 3 months pregnant and fully focused on the life growing inside her. On February 1st, the day she would die, Sandra spent her time preparing. She had an appointment scheduled with her OB/GYN for February 10th. She had already contacted a photographer for newborn pictures. She was drafting plans for a gender reveal and a formal pregnancy announcement. That same afternoon, she had searched online for baby products and compared different brands. Everything pointed to a young woman with her eyes fixed on the future. Her movements that day were also recorded. In the early afternoon, she entered her building while chatting on her phone. At around 5 p.m., she went to the lobby again to pick up a food delivery. About 45 minutes later, she stepped outside to clear snow from her car, preparing for the blizzard that was beginning to hit Massachusetts. Days later, when officers arrived for the welfare check, her car was buried under snow. It had not been touched since that night. When investigators began asking questions, friends, co-workers, and family members pointed to the same person. The man Sandra said was the father of her child. That man was Detective Matthew Farwell of the Stoughton Police Department. He was 38 years old, married since 2013, and the father of 3. Detective Matthew Farwell was not just any officer. He had been involved with the Police Explorers program since joining the Stoughton Department in 2012. That was the same time he first crossed paths with Sandra. She was only 14 years old. Years later, when investigators asked about his connection to her, Farwell admitted they had rekindled contact. He told colleagues that he had reconnected with Sandra only months earlier after a night of heavy drinking. He admitted they had been intimate and acknowledged meeting her once or twice more after that. But he denied being the father of her unborn child. According to him, the timing did not make sense. Farwell insisted that their relationship had ended. He said he had been pulling away from her and finally ended it for good on February 1st, the night she died. He described going to her apartment that evening and said the breakup had turned into an argument. Sandra was emotional, he claimed, but very much alive when he walked out the door. To his fellow officers, that explanation might have been convenient. It gave them a way to close the case without digging deeper. But to the people who knew Sandra, Farwell's account never rang true. She was not secretive. If anything, she was the opposite. Sandra shared openly about her life, sometimes to the discomfort of her co-workers. Family members also recalled that she often spoke about things they wished she would keep private. Her cousin remembered summers spent together, laughing and swimming in the backyard pool. Sandra was sharp, funny, and unfiltered. Over time, she revealed things that unsettled her relatives. She told them she might have been romantically involved with one of her instructors from the Explorers program. It upset her family deeply, but Sandra continued to talk about the officer she was seeing. In their eyes, there was no doubt who the father of her unborn child was. She had been talking about him for years. Sandra also told her cousin that this was not her first pregnancy. She had suffered a miscarriage before. According to her, the father then, too, had been a police officer. Losing that baby had devastated her. Which is why, when she found herself pregnant again and everything seemed to be going well, she was overjoyed. In the days before her death, she was openly celebrating the fact that she was finally going to be a mother. After her death, her family released a statement that cut straight to the heart of who Sandra was. They said her greatest dream was to have a child, and that she would have been a wonderful mother. In May 2021, the pathologist at the state medical examiner's office released the official finding. The manner of Sandra Birchmore's death was ruled suicide. To those who knew her, it was impossible to accept. She had been full of anticipation, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her baby on the way. That was one of the reasons her family and friends refused to believe she had taken her own life. Farwell's admission of a relationship with Sandra forced the Stoughton Police Department to launch an internal investigation. They needed to look into the nature of his connection with her and whether it traced back to her years in the Explorers program. When the findings were released in September, they shook the entire community. The details of what had happened to Sandra and the role played by the men she trusted most were devastating. The police chief himself addressed the public with words that revealed just how far the betrayal had gone. He said Sandra was a vulnerable young woman whose entire life had been shaped by her admiration for people in uniform. Police officers, military members, anyone who had taken an oath to protect and serve. That admiration made her easy to manipulate. And the men she looked up to, the men she trusted, used it against her. According to the chief, Sandra was not just failed. She was taken advantage of, deceived, and used by the very authority figures she believed would keep her safe. And that exploitation lasted right up until her final days. The internal investigation revealed that Sandra's trust had been shattered by more than one man in uniform. 3 members of the Stoughton Police Department were directly implicated. Detective Matthew Farwell, his twin brother Officer William Farwell, and former Deputy Chief Robert Devine, who had once led the Explorers program where Sandra first entered their orbit. The findings were damning. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Matthew's personal involvement with Sandra began when she was only 15 years old. He was 27 at the time. Massachusetts law sets the age of consent at 16. That meant Sandra was underage when their relationship first turned sexual. The investigation did not stop there. It revealed that both William Farwell and Robert Devine had physical relationships with Sandra that continued up until the time of her death. William was even found to have tried to introduce her to other men, pulling her deeper into a web of exploitation. At least one officer outside of Stoughton was implicated as well. That man was identified as Joshua Heel of the Abington Police Department. For Devine, this was not the first time his conduct had brought shame on the department. In 2014, explicit photos of him and a mistress were sent by email to fellow officers and their spouses. The scandal forced him to step down from his leadership role, but despite the embarrassment, he was not fired. Instead, he was reassigned to patrol, where he remained until this new investigation. When the truth came out about Sandra, the pressure was too great to ignore. Matthew and William Farwell, along with Robert Devine, resigned from the department. Steps were also taken to ensure that none of the 3 men could ever return to law enforcement. Their certifications were stripped, effectively banning them from wearing a badge again. The reaction from the community and the current police chief was one of disgust. The details of how Sandra had been treated horrified the public. Yet, even with multiple witnesses who could confirm what Sandra herself had shared with them, Norfolk County prosecutors decided not to pursue criminal charges. The district attorney's office said the case was too weak. The investigation also revealed that there had been opportunities to intervene before Sandra's death. In January of that year, a friend of Sandra's who was owed money called the Stoughton Police Department. During that call, the friend mentioned that Detective Matthew Farwell should be the one to help recover the debt, because he was in a sexual relationship with Sandra. Instead of treating that information as evidence of misconduct, the officer who took the call passed it directly to Farwell himself. Farwell told the officer to keep quiet and not tell anyone else. That instruction was followed. The information went nowhere. After Sandra's death, another friend came forward immediately, offering police details that implicated Farwell in foul play. But even then, the warnings were brushed aside. The pattern was clear. Sandra had grown up without her father. She wanted attention, love, and stability. The men who were supposed to guide and protect her filled that role in the worst possible way. They became father figures, mentors, and protectors in her eyes. But instead of offering support, they groomed her. They exploited her trust. They used her admiration of police officers as a weapon against her, and they never stopped until the very end. When the results of the internal investigation became public, the reaction across Canton and nearby Stoughton was immediate. The two towns are only a few miles apart, and both communities were stunned by the revelations. As the disturbing details came out, outrage spread far beyond Sandra's death. People began questioning whether corruption ran through the entire Norfolk County justice system. Many found it impossible to believe Sandra could have been entangled with so many police officers for so many years without it being common knowledge. To them, this was not a secret affair kept in the shadows. It was something openly known, whispered about, and tolerated inside law enforcement circles, possibly across the county itself. For families in the community, that realization cut deep. One resident put it plainly: parents encourage their children to admire the police, to consider careers where they can serve a higher purpose. But in Sandra's case, that trust was twisted into betrayal. "What the hell is going on?" one person asked. "Who is in charge? And are they being held accountable?" Others echoed the same frustration, saying that the legal system had allowed corruption to fester, and that cover-ups had destroyed the public's trust. And Sandra's case was not the only scandal to raise those questions. Almost exactly 1 year after her death, another tragedy struck Norfolk County. Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found dead in the snow after an argument with his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Karen was arrested and later tried for his murder. But outside the courthouse, protests erupted almost daily. Supporters insisted Canton police had framed Karen and were protecting the real killer. The case exploded across Boston media, drew national attention, and fueled widespread conspiracy theories. It was no surprise to some when connections between the two cases began to surface. Personnel who worked on Sandra's death investigation were also tied to the O'Keefe case. Both were under the jurisdiction of the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office. 2 Canton officers and 3 Massachusetts State Police detectives, one from each force, had all investigated Sandra's death, and every single one of them came to the same conclusion: that it was not a homicide. That decision ignored the evidence and testimony from those who knew Sandra best. Her family insisted she was overjoyed about her pregnancy. Friends told investigators that Sandra had confided in them about fights with Detective Matthew Farwell, the man she named as the father. She had told him she expected $4,000 a month in child support and an additional $33,000 to cover daycare costs. She also told her friends they argued about whether he would sign the birth certificate. At one point, according to her friends, Farwell said flatly that he was not the father and that he wished she would die. The Massachusetts State Police documented those accounts, but they did not pursue them further. Meanwhile, reports surfaced that Farwell himself had been venting to colleagues. Over drinks, he allegedly complained that state police investigators were even looking into him at all. He seemed to expect the matter to be swept aside immediately by fellow officers. In March 2021, State Trooper Nick Guarino asked Farwell to hand over both his personal and work-issued cell phones. Guarino was responsible for extracting the data, and notably, he also worked on the Karen Reed case. Defense attorneys in that trial later accused him of failing to retrieve key data. During cross-examination in the O'Keefe case, Guarino admitted that the phone extraction had not captured everything stored on the device. The same issue appeared in Sandra's case. After keeping Farwell's phones for months, Guarino reported in August that he could not locate a single message between Matthew and Sandra on either device. It wasn't until a federal expert stepped in to assist the Internal Affairs probe that the real depth of Sandra's relationship with Detective Farwell was uncovered. By pulling data directly from the phones, the expert retrieved more than 32,000 text messages exchanged between Sandra and Matthew in just the year leading up to her death. Despite that mountain of evidence, the county declined to pursue charges. But Sandra's family refused to let the matter rest. In late 2022, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Stoughton. The complaint accused the department of negligence, emotional distress, pain, and suffering, and enabling a years-long grooming scheme at the hands of 3 police officers. It argued that Sandra's death was the direct result of the abuse she suffered under their authority. The lawsuit didn't have to label her death as homicide in order to hold these men responsible. But the family also made it clear they never accepted the state's ruling of suicide. To challenge that finding, they turned to one of the most respected voices in forensic medicine, Dr. Michael Baden. After reviewing the original autopsy and its conclusions, Dr. Baden reached a very different determination. In his opinion, Sandra had not died by hanging. She had been strangled. The cause of death was homicide. The FBI soon took over the investigation, removing it from local and state police. They enlisted 2 additional medical examiners to review the same evidence, the photos and documentation from Sandra's autopsy. Both examiners independently reached the same conclusion as Dr. Baden. Sandra had been attacked, she had struggled, and she had been killed. If investigators had seriously examined her correspondence with Detective Farwell, they would have seen how the relationship shifted dramatically on December 28, 2020. That was the day Sandra told Matthew she was pregnant. Their exchanges revealed something chilling. Sandra hadn't stumbled into pregnancy by accident. She had been planning for it. Messages showed that for nearly 8 years, their physical relationship continued almost without pause. The texts also revealed Matthew's disturbing hold over her, reliving encounters from when she was still a teenager and he was already in his late 30s, exploiting a girl who saw him as a hero in uniform. By October 2020, Sandra's frustration was boiling over. She drafted a message meant for Matthew's wife, but sent it instead to a friend. It read, "I am just messaging to inform you that your husband, Matthew, has been out cheating on you since before you guys were even married." That friend immediately told her that Matthew's wife was pregnant with their 3rd child, due in February. On the very same day, Sandra began pressing Matthew to visit her at specific points in her cycle. She wanted a child of her own, and Matthew, at least in person, appeared to agree. But 2 months later, when Sandra finally shared that she was pregnant, his reaction was explosive. She confronted him over text, furious at how he was behaving. "I'm mad you're acting how you are over a choice we both made. I'm mad you act like you gave anyone a choice. LMAO. Oh, so you didn't have a choice? Per usual, you make and do whatever you want. You're mad she's due in February and I'm in September, and you don't know how you're going to be there for both of us. You are truly the worst person on the face of the earth." Sandra's pregnancy was not just an inconvenience to him, it was a threat. And his anger only intensified after Sandra's friend placed that call to the department, outing his relationship with her directly to his colleagues. When Matthew spoke to one of his colleagues about Sandra, his panic was clear. He said, "You have no idea how bad what she did is. I literally can't believe this is even real life. Like, what else do I have to worry about now? Which other friend will do something tomorrow?" He knew her friends were talking, and he knew the walls were closing in. At least 3 of Sandra's friends later told investigators that in the weeks before her death, Matthew had turned physically violent whenever the pregnancy came up. Sandra was only 4'10". Matthew Farwell was 6'4". The size difference alone tells you how terrifying that must have been. Just 10 days before she died, Sandra told friends that Matthew had snapped after she showed him a sonogram photo of her baby. His response? "That's not my child. I don't want anything really to do with you." And then he shoved her to the ground. But what happened in the final week before Sandra's death was even more chilling. Matthew's rage seemed to vanish. Suddenly, he was agreeable, telling her they could discuss putting his name on the birth certificate. He even brought up something from months earlier, her offer to give him a key to her apartment. Back in October, he had brushed it off, saying it was a bad idea. But now, records show, he actually had a copy made. Matthew also wanted more access. He asked Sandra for the passcode to her building in Canton Woods. Was it the same for all tenants, he wondered? Or was it just hers? On January 24th, just days before she was killed, Sandra told a friend that Matthew had come over. She said, "He asked me if I'd give him a key and said that if I keep it a secret, meaning the baby, he'll be around and see them and all that. So it's somewhere." But that wasn't all. That same night, she noticed him moving strangely through her apartment. She texted another friend saying, "Like last night, he opened my closet door for something, and then he went into my bathroom, looking at my bathroom. It was just really odd. He started looking around. I don't know why. Haven't figured that out." Then came February 1st. Sandra was captured on her building's security camera at about 5:01 in the evening, accepting a DoorDash delivery. A little while later, she stepped outside with a snow brush, clearing off her car as the blizzard rolled in. What investigators eventually discovered was that the timestamps on the cameras were 13 minutes off from actual time. That detail matters, because the very last time Sandra was seen alive on video was at 5:33 p.m. By a little after 9 that same evening, everything had changed. That night, Matthew texted Sandra, asking if he could stop by for a moment. The cameras inside her Canton apartment building captured what happened next. At 9:14 p.m., Detective Farwell walked in. He wasn't dressed for duty. He wore street clothes, a hoodie pulled up over his head, and a face mask. That detail stood out right away. Multiple people who knew him told investigators that Matthew hated wearing masks. He only wore them when his department forced him to. But here he was, hiding his face on camera. The surveillance video shows him leaving at 9:43 p.m., less than 30 minutes later. When questioned, Matthew told police that this was when he ended his so-called brief fling with Sandra. He insisted she was alive when he walked out. But Sandra's phone told a very different story. Health data pulled from her iPhone showed her last movement at 9:40 p.m. She had taken exactly 8 steps. 3 minutes later, Matthew was caught on video exiting the building. When investigators later found Sandra's phone, it was lying 12 feet away from her right hand. The battery finally drained 2 days later, shutting off on February 3rd. It would take years before Matthew was finally held accountable. On August 28, 2024, Federal authorities arrested him. He was indicted on a charge rarely seen outside of organized crime cases: killing a witness or victim. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office had taken over, pulling the case out of the hands of local and state investigators who had stumbled and stalled under a cloud of corruption. The case they laid out was clear. Matthew killed Sandra to silence her. His wife had gone into labor that night, leaving him free to act without drawing suspicion. The storm that buried Canton in snow worked in his favor too, guaranteeing that no one would discover Sandra for days. And Matthew had prepared. He had scoped out her apartment a week before, opening doors, looking around, memorizing the layout. He knew how to stage a scene. This was a man trained in crime scene analysis, and he used every bit of that training to make Sandra's murder look like a suicide. Then he counted on loyalty within law enforcement to cover for him, to glance past evidence that pointed directly at his guilt. But loyalty couldn't erase the truth. And now, with the FBI involved, Matthew Farwell sits in custody, awaiting the justice Sandra Birchmore never lived to see. If Matthew Farwell is convicted, he could face the death penalty. But Sandra's story isn't just about one corrupt officer. It exposes a system that allowed abuse to thrive in plain sight. Early in 2024, the Marshall Project published an investigation showing just how deep the problem runs. Across the country, police explorer programs, the same kind Sandra joined at 12 years old, have been plagued by sexual abuse and misconduct allegations. Oversight was often non-existent. Officers who preyed on vulnerable teenagers weren't always prosecuted, and even when they were, about half avoided serious punishment. Some served only a few days in jail. Others did time, but most walked away with their careers intact. Stoughton's own records tell the same story. Their program operated with little accountability until it was finally shut down. Sandra never got to hold her baby. She never got the chance to live the life she was so excited for. But her case, her truth, has grown bigger than one woman, bigger than one town. It's a story about trust, accountability, and the price of silence. That was the tragic case of Sandra Birchmore. If you believe she deserves justice, let her story be heard. Share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more cases where the truth refuses to stay buried.